July 15th, 1997, Miami Beach, 8:45 in the morning. The sun is already burning hot, turning the pastel Art Deco buildings into candy-colored mirages. The tourists are just beginning to stir. The beautiful people are still sleeping off last night's excess, and on Ocean Drive, one of the most famous men in the world is about to die. His name is Gianni Versace. You know the name even if you don't follow fashion. Versace means luxury, glamour, sex, power. He dressed royalty and rock stars. He turned runways into cultural events. He built an empire on beauty, and he lived in a mansion that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Casa Casuarina. 3 stories of Mediterranean revival opulence, right there on Ocean Drive, painted in shades of coral and terracotta, with a pool lined in 24-karat gold. This morning, Versace is doing what he does most mornings, walking to the news cafe, a few blocks from his mansion, to pick up magazines. Italian Vogue, international papers, his daily ritual. He's wearing shorts and a casual shirt. No bodyguards, no security detail, just a man on a morning walk in the neighborhood he loves. He doesn't know he's being watched, doesn't know that for the past several weeks, someone has been studying his routine, learning his patterns, waiting for the perfect moment, planning an execution that will shock the world and end one of the most bizarre, terrifying crime sprees in American history. The man watching him is 27 years old, handsome, charming when he wants to be. His name is Andrew Cunanan, and he's already killed 4 people in the past 3 months. 4 murders across 4 states, each one more brutal than the last. The FBI has him on their 10 most wanted list. His face has been on the news for weeks. Every cop in America is looking for him. And yet, here he is, in Miami Beach, living in a cheap hotel, walking the same streets as his intended victim, hiding in plain sight in one of the most visible places in America. It's incomprehensible, it's infuriating, and it's about to become a tragedy that will dominate headlines for months. But this story doesn't start in Miami, it starts months earlier, in Minneapolis, in Chicago, in New Jersey. It starts with a man who seemed to have everything: charm, intelligence, connections to the wealthy and powerful. A man who moved through elite gay social circles with ease, telling elaborate stories about his privileged background, his education, his prospects. All lies, every word. Andrew Cunanan was a con artist who'd built his entire life on deception. And when that life started to crumble, when the lies couldn't hold anymore, when the men who'd been supporting him started to pull away, something inside him broke. Something violent. Something irreversible. The transformation from charming socialite to serial killer didn't happen overnight. But when it happened, it was explosive, brutal, seemingly random. He killed people he knew, people he'd loved, then people he'd just met, then strangers whose only crime was being in the wrong place when Andrew Cunanan needed something they had. A hammer to the skull, multiple gunshots, torture, theft. He left a trail of bodies across the country, each crime scene more horrifying than the last. And law enforcement, despite massive resources and nationwide attention, couldn't catch him. Couldn't even get close. Until Miami. Until Versace. Until that morning in July, when Andrew Cunanan decided to make his final statement. To take down someone so famous, so beloved, so seemingly untouchable, that the whole world would have to remember his name. This is the story of that manhunt, of those murders, of the victims whose lives were stolen, of the investigators who chased a ghost across state lines, of the moment when a serial killer and a fashion icon's paths converged on the steps of a mansion in Miami Beach. It's a story about obsession, about narcissism, about what happens when charm curdles into rage, about how someone can kill 4 people in plain sight and still walk free for months, about how the most dangerous predators are often the ones who smile the brightest. And it's a story without real answers, because Andrew Cunanan took his secrets to the grave. We know what he did, we know how he did it, but we'll never know why. Not really. The motivation died with him, leaving behind only victims, trauma, and endless speculation. Gianni Versace is walking back from the cafe now, He's carrying magazines, thinking about his day, about designs, about the empire he's built, about the beauty he's created. He has no idea these are his last moments, no idea that a man with a gun is watching him climb the steps to his front door, no idea that in 30 seconds everything will change. For him, for his family, for the fashion world, for everyone who'd been following the Andrew Cunanan manhunt with horrified fascination. For Miami Beach itself, which will never quite shake the shadow of what's about to happen. 2 gunshots, that's all it will take. 2 bullets. And one of the most famous men in the world will be dead on his own doorstep. The killer will disappear into the morning crowd, and the final act of a cross-country killing spree will begin its strange, surreal conclusion. This is the story of Andrew Cunanan, the serpent who slithered into paradise, the charming psychopath who became America's most wanted, the man who killed for reasons we'll never fully understand. And this is the story of Gianni Versace, the designer who dressed the world, the artist who made beauty his religion, the man whose morning routine would be his undoing. 2 men, 2 very different lives, converging at the worst possible moment in the worst possible way. One seeking fame through destruction, one already famous, seeking only a quiet morning walk. The sun is shining, Miami Beach is waking up, and on Ocean Drive, history is about to be written in blood. Let's begin. Andrew Philip Cunanan was born on August 31st, 1969, in National City, California, a working-class suburb of San Diego. He was the youngest of 4 children, and from the very beginning, he was different, special, or at least that's what his father told him, repeatedly, obsessively, to the exclusion of his other children. Modesto Pete Cunanan was a Filipino immigrant who'd worked his way up to a position as a stockbroker. He wasn't wealthy, but he'd achieved a level of success that allowed him to live comfortably, to project an image of prosperity. And he saw in his youngest son something he'd never seen in his other children: potential, intelligence, the possibility of greatness. Andrew was smart, genuinely smart. IQ tests put him at 147, which is in the gifted range. He could read before kindergarten. He had a photographic memory. He could charm adults with sophisticated conversation while other kids his age were playing with toys. His father doted on him, gave him everything he wanted, told him constantly that he was destined for exceptional things. This favoritism wasn't subtle. Andrew's siblings watched as their father lavished attention and resources on the youngest child while largely ignoring them. It created resentment, distance, a family dynamic that was fractured from the start. But it also created something dangerous in Andrew, a sense of entitlement, a belief that he was inherently superior to others, a conviction that the world owed him recognition, success, adoration. Not because he'd earned it, but simply because he was Andrew Cunanan. His mother, Mary Ann, was devout Catholic, quieter, less demonstrative. She tried to balance her husband's excessive praise with some grounding in reality, but it was a losing battle. Pete Cunanan had decided his son was special, and nothing would shake that conviction. Andrew attended an elite private school in La Jolla, the Bishop School, on scholarship. He excelled academically. He was in the theatre program, naturally gravitating toward performance, toward being seen, being admired. His classmates remember him as charming, funny, quick-witted, but also intense, sometimes too much, too eager to be liked, too desperate for attention. He was also, even in high school, a masterful liar, not about small things, about everything, his background, his family's wealth, his connections. He would tell elaborate stories about vacations to Europe, about famous people his family knew, about opportunities that awaited him. Most of it was fiction, but he told these lies with such confidence, such detail, that people believed him, or at least they didn't challenge him. This pattern, constructing an elaborate false identity and selling it through sheer force of personality, would define his entire adult life. After graduating from Bishop's in 1987, Andrew briefly attended the University of California, San Diego. He lasted less than 2 years. Not because he wasn't smart enough. He was. But college required discipline, consistency, actual work. Andrew preferred shortcuts. He preferred to be recognized for his intelligence without having to prove it through grades or achievement. He dropped out and immersed himself in San Diego's gay community. This was the late 1980s, early 1990s. The AIDS crisis was devastating the community. Fear and grief were everywhere. But there was also defiance, celebration, a determination to live fully in the face of death. Americans thrived in this environment, not because he contributed anything meaningful, but because his particular skills, charm, conversation, the ability to make people feel special, were valued. He became a fixture at parties, at clubs, at social gatherings. He was the guy who knew everyone, who could get you into exclusive events, who always had a story that was just slightly more interesting than yours. But he had no money, no job, no prospects. So he did what came naturally. He found older, wealthier men who would support him. He became, essentially, a kept man, a very attractive, very charming escort who provided companionship and sex in exchange for rent, meals, clothes, access to a lifestyle he couldn't afford on his own. Some of these relationships lasted months, others were transactional. Andrew moved between benefactors, always maintaining multiple connections, always cultivating new prospects. He was building a safety net, ensuring he would never have to work a regular job, never have to sacrifice his image of himself as someone destined for wealth and status. His friends from this period describe him as funny, engaging, brilliant at conversation. He could discuss art, literature, history, politics. He'd read extensively and remembered everything. Dinner with Andrew was never boring. He was endlessly entertaining. But there was something underneath. A brittleness, a defensiveness when questioned too closely, a tendency toward mood swings, gregarious one moment, withdrawn the next, and an increasing reliance on lies to maintain his image. He claimed to have attended elite universities, claimed to have family money, claimed to be connected to famous people in fashion and entertainment. Some friends believed him. Others were skeptical but didn't push. In their social circle, everyone was performing some version of themselves. Andrew's performance was just more elaborate than most. By the mid-1990s, he was approaching 30, and 30 is a dangerous age for someone whose entire identity is built on youth, charm, and the promise of potential. The men who'd been supporting him were getting tired. They wanted actual companionship, not just a charming facade. They were noticing the lies, the financial dependence, the lack of any real substance beneath the performance. Andrew's primary benefactor, an older man named Norman Blatchford, eventually ended their relationship. It was amicable, but final. Blatchford had supported Andrew for years, providing him with a luxury condo, spending money, access to an affluent lifestyle. Without that support, Andrew's carefully constructed world began to collapse. He tried to maintain the lifestyle, ran up credit card debt, borrowed money from friends, made promises he couldn't keep. But the cracks were showing. People were starting to avoid him. The invitations to parties stopped coming. The social circle that had validated his identity was closing its doors. And Andrew, faced with the possibility that he might have to get an actual job, live modestly, admit that his grand destiny wasn't materializing, began to spiral. He became depressed, angry, resentful. He blamed others for his situation, blamed the men who'd stopped supporting him, blamed friends who'd moved on with their lives, blamed the world for not recognizing his exceptional nature. This resentment festered, grew, transformed from bitterness into something darker, something violent. There were warning signs: increased drug use, erratic behavior, outbursts of anger. But in retrospect, everyone who knew him would say the same thing. We never thought he was capable of violence. Manipulation, yes. Lying, certainly. But murder? Impossible. Andrew was too charming, too civilized, too concerned with his image to ever cross that line. They were wrong. In early 1997, Andrew made several trips from San Diego to Minneapolis. He was visiting friends there, including two men who would soon become his first victims, Jeffrey Trail and David Madsen. Trail was a former naval officer, now working in sales. He'd known Andrew for years, possibly been romantically involved with him at some point. Their relationship was complicated, competitive, tinged with resentment on both sides. Madsen was an architect, successful, settled, in a relationship with Trail. He'd also known Andrew for years, also possibly been romantically involved with him. The three of them represented a triangle of complicated history, unresolved feelings, and mounting tensions. Andrew's visits to Minneapolis in early 1997 were tense. Arguments happened, confrontations about Andrew's lies, his financial situation, his increasingly erratic behavior. Trail and Madsen were pulling away, establishing boundaries, making it clear that Andrew couldn't just show up and expect their support. For someone whose entire identity was built on being wanted, being valued, being included, this rejection was devastating. More than devastating, it was intolerable. Something snapped, or maybe nothing snapped. Maybe the violence was always there, just waiting for the right trigger. Maybe Andrew Cunanan had always been capable of murder, and all it took was the right combination of desperation, resentment, and opportunity. In April 1997, Andrew bought a one-way ticket to Minneapolis. He told friends in San Diego he was taking a trip, visiting old friends, maybe looking for opportunities. No one thought anything of it. Andrew was always traveling, always visiting someone. What he was actually planning, no one knows for certain. Did he intend to kill Jeffrey Trail when he arrived? Or did the murder happen spontaneously, the result of an argument that escalated beyond control? We'll never know. Because Andrew took those answers with him to the grave. All we know is what happened next. And what happened next would launch one of the most intensive manhunts in FBI history, leave 5 people dead, and terrify a nation. The charming socialite was about to become a serial killer. The man who'd spent his life cultivating an image of sophistication and success was about to reveal himself as something else entirely, something monstrous, something that had been hiding behind the smile all along. The predator was ready. The first victim was waiting, unknowing, in Minneapolis. And Andrew Cunanan, the man who'd lied about everything else in his life, was about to tell one final, terrible truth. He was capable of anything. The genesis was complete. The serpent was about to strike. April 27th, 1997, Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's a Sunday evening. Spring is finally arriving after a long Minnesota winter. The city is starting to wake up, people emerging from hibernation, enjoying the warmer weather. In an apartment building in the Loring Park neighborhood, something terrible is happening. Something that will change everything. Andrew Cunanan had arrived in Minneapolis a few days earlier. He'd been staying with David Madsen, the architect, in his loft apartment. The visit had been tense from the start. Madsen was in a relationship with Jeffrey Trail. Andrew's presence was uncomfortable, unwelcome, a reminder of complicated history that everyone wanted to forget. There had been arguments about Andrew's lifestyle, about his lies, about money he'd borrowed and never repaid, about his refusal to get his life together. Trail, in particular, had been harsh. He told Andrew he needed to leave, to stop showing up and expecting people to take care of him, to face reality. For Andrew, this rejection was unbearable. These weren't strangers criticizing him. These were people who knew him, who'd once valued him, who were now seeing through the facade and rejecting what they found underneath. On that Sunday evening, Jeffrey Trail came to David Madsen's apartment. Why exactly he came is unclear. Maybe to confront Andrew. Maybe to support Madsen in asking Andrew to leave. Maybe just to pick something up. The details are lost to time and the chaos that followed. What we know is this. Sometime that evening, Andrew Cunanan picked up a claw hammer, the kind you'd use for construction, for pulling nails, with a curved claw on one side and a flat striking surface on the other. A tool, a weapon. And he attacked Jeffrey Trail. The violence was explosive, brutal, personal. Andrew struck Trail in the head repeatedly with the hammer, more than 20 times. The blows shattered Trail's skull, crushing bone, destroying tissue. The rage behind the attack was immense, uncontrolled. Trail tried to defend himself. There was a struggle, furniture was overturned, blood spattered across the apartment. But Andrew didn't stop, kept striking, kept destroying, until Jeffrey Trail was dead on the floor of David Madsen's apartment, his head a ruin, his blood soaking into the carpet. David Madsen was there, witnessed the murder, or arrived just after. The exact timeline is unclear, but what's certain is that Madsen became, in that moment, both a witness and a hostage. What happened in the hours and days after that murder is one of the most debated aspects of the case. Why didn't Madsen run? Why didn't he go to the police? Why did he stay with Andrew for 3 days while Jeffrey Trail's body lay wrapped in a rug in his apartment? Some believe Madsen was terrified, held at gunpoint, forced to cooperate. Others think he might have been complicit somehow, involved in the murder, or at least in the cover-up. Still others believe there was something more complicated happening. Trauma, shock, a kind of Stockholm syndrome developing in real time. We'll never know for certain, because David Madsen didn't survive to tell his story. For 3 days, Andrew and David stayed in the apartment with Trail's body. They went out, were seen together at a bar, at a restaurant. Madsen seemed nervous, but not overtly distressed. Andrew seemed normal, even cheerful. No one who saw them had any idea that they were sleeping in an apartment with a corpse. This is one of the most chilling aspects of Andrew Cunanan's psychology, his ability to compartmentalize, to commit horrific violence and then go have dinner as if nothing had happened, to carry on conversations, smile, laugh, all while a man he'd just killed lay dead a few rooms away. On April 29th, 2 days after Trail's murder, Andrew and David left Minneapolis. They took Trail's red Jeep Cherokee. They drove north, toward Duluth, toward the Minnesota-Wisconsin border, toward remote areas where people rarely go. David Madsen was driving. Andrew was in the passenger seat. They stopped at a pawn shop. Andrew sold a gold coin, something he'd stolen from Trail. They were on security footage. Madsen looked tense but cooperative. Andrew looked relaxed. They drove to a remote area called East Rush Lake, about 50 miles north of Minneapolis. It's isolated, forested, the kind of place where you could fire a gunshot and no one would hear. On April 30th, fishermen found David Madsen's body on the shore of the lake. He'd been shot multiple times, 3 bullets to the head, 3 to the back. Execution style, clinical, cold. Whatever had happened between Andrew and David in those 3 days, it ended here. Whether Madsen had been a hostage the entire time, or a reluctant accomplice who tried to escape, or something else entirely, we'll never know. All we know is that Andrew Cunanan decided he had to die. And so he did. The discovery of Madsen's body triggered an immediate law enforcement response. Minneapolis police had already been looking for both men after a friend had discovered Trail's body in the apartment. But finding Madsen dead elevated everything. This wasn't one murder, this was 2, possibly more. They had a serial killer on their hands, and he was driving a red Jeep Cherokee, and he was armed, and he'd just proven he was willing to kill not just in rage, but also in cold blood. The monster wasn't just violent, he was calculating. The FBI was called in. A multi-state manhunt was launched. Andrew Cunanan's photograph was distributed to police departments across the country. His background was investigated. Friends and family were interviewed. His financial records were examined. A profile was being built. What emerged was disturbing. Andrew Cunanan was intelligent, charming, charismatic. He had no history of violence, no criminal record, no warning signs that would have flagged him as dangerous. He was, by all accounts, the harmless social climber who lied about his accomplishments but never hurt anyone. Until he did. And when he did, the violence wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was brutal, decisive, complete. He transformed from charming socialite to killer without any apparent transition period. The metamorphosis was instant and total. Psychologists would later debate what had triggered this transformation. Was it the rejection by Trail and Madsen? Was it the collapse of his carefully constructed life? Was it drug use? Andrew was known to use crystal meth, which can trigger paranoia and aggression. Was it a latent psychopathy that had always been there, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? Or was it simpler than that? Was it just narcissism pushed to its logical extreme? Andrew Cunanan had spent his entire life believing he was special. that the world owed him recognition and success. When reality failed to match his expectations, when people stopped supporting him, when his lies stopped working, maybe violence was the only option left. If he couldn't be famous for his intelligence or his charm, he could be famous for this, for being the man everyone was hunting, for making the world pay attention, even if that attention came through terror. Back in Minneapolis, the investigation was expanding. Trail's apartment was processed as a crime scene. Blood evidence was collected. The hammer used in the killing was recovered. Witnesses were interviewed. A timeline was being constructed. Friends of Trail and Madsen were in shock. These were beloved members of their community. Trail was a former military officer, respected and liked. Madsen was a talented architect with a bright future, and they'd been murdered by someone they knew, someone they'd trusted, someone they'd considered a friend. The gay community in Minneapolis was particularly traumatized. This wasn't a hate crime committed by strangers. This was internal. One of their own had turned on them. The sense of betrayal was profound, and Andrew Cunanan was nowhere to be found. He'd vanished completely. The red Jeep hadn't been spotted. No credit card transactions, no phone calls. It was as if he'd disappeared into thin air. But he hadn't disappeared. He was driving, south and east, putting distance between himself and the crime scenes, and he was already looking for his next victim, because whatever had been unleashed in that Minneapolis apartment wasn't satisfied. The violence wasn't finished. Andrew Cunanan had discovered something about himself in the act of killing Jeffrey Trail. He'd discovered he could do it, that he was capable of taking a life, that he could commit the ultimate transgression and not only survive, but feel something. Power, maybe. Control. The ultimate expression of superiority over another person. He'd killed twice now. The first time had been rage. The second had been necessity, eliminating a witness. But there would be more, because Andrew had crossed a line that most people can't even see, let alone cross. And once you're on the other side of that line, there's no going back. There's only forward, into more violence, more death, more chaos. The FBI didn't know it yet, but they weren't just hunting a double murderer. They were hunting someone who was just getting started, someone who was accelerating, escalating, becoming more dangerous with each killing. The serpent had tasted blood, and it was hungry for more. Chicago was next on his route, a city big enough to disappear into, rich enough to provide targets, close enough to reach before the nationwide manhunt could close in. And in Chicago lived a man who had no idea his name was about to be added to the list of Andrew Cunanan's victims. A man who would die for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A man whose murder would prove that Andrew Cunanan was no longer just killing people he knew. He was killing anyone who had something he wanted. The trail of blood was just beginning, and it would stretch from Minnesota to New Jersey before finally ending in Miami Beach in the death of the most famous victim of all. But we're not there yet. We're still in the early days of the manhunt, still trying to understand who Andrew Cunanan really is, still hoping he can be caught before he kills again. That hope would be disappointed, brutally, repeatedly, because Andrew Cunanan had become something unstoppable. Not because he was skilled or experienced, but because he was desperate, unhinged, and willing to do absolutely anything to anyone. The charming mask was gone, the sophisticated socialite had vanished. All that remained was the predator, and the predator was hunting. May 3rd, 1997, Chicago, Illinois. It's a Saturday morning in one of Chicago's most affluent neighborhoods, the Gold Coast, where mansions line the streets and wealth is displayed with understated elegance, where people feel safe because safety is something money can buy, or so they think. Lee Miglin was 72 years old, a self-made millionaire, a real estate developer who'd built a fortune creating luxury properties across Chicago. He was respected, admired, a pillar of the community. He lived with his wife Marilyn, a successful businesswoman and beauty mogul, in a magnificent townhouse on East Scott Street. That Saturday, Marilyn was out of town on business. Lee was home alone, working in his garage, tending to his cars, enjoying a quiet morning. He had no idea he was about to become the third victim of a man he'd never met. a man who had no reason to kill him beyond simple, brutal necessity. Andrew Cunanan had driven the stolen red Jeep from Minnesota to Chicago. He needed money. He needed a new car. He needed to keep moving. The manhunt was intensifying. His face was being shown on the news. Police across the Midwest were looking for him. He couldn't stay in one place, couldn't use credit cards, couldn't risk being recognized. So he went hunting, looking for a target, someone wealthy, someone vulnerable, someone who could provide what he needed. How he found Lee Miglin remains unclear. Some theories suggest he'd known Miglin previously, that they'd met in Chicago's gay social scene years earlier. Others believe it was random, that Andrew simply cruised affluent neighborhoods looking for an opportunity. The FBI investigated both possibilities extensively and never reached a definitive conclusion. What we know is that sometime on May 3rd, Andrew Cunanan gained entry to the Miglin home. How he got in is also unclear. Did he force his way in? Did Miglin let him in, perhaps recognizing him or simply being polite? Did Andrew break in when Miglin was elsewhere and wait for him to return? However it happened, once Andrew had access to Lee Miglin, what followed was one of the most brutal murders of the entire spree. Miglin was bound with duct tape, his hands, his feet, his face was covered, making breathing difficult. He was forced into the garage, into a position of complete helplessness, and then Andrew Cunanan tortured him. The details are horrific. Miglin was stabbed repeatedly with pruning shears, multiple wounds to the chest and throat. His ribs were broken. His face was beaten. The attack went on for an extended period. This wasn't a quick killing. This was prolonged, sadistic violence. At some point, Andrew slit Miglin's throat. Then, in a final act of desecration, he ran over the body with Miglin's own car. Multiple times, back and forth, crushing bones, destroying what remained of the human being Lee Miglin had been. Why? Why such excessive violence against a man he barely knew, if he knew him at all? The FBI profilers struggled with this question. Was it rage? Was it some kind of sexual component? Was Andrew establishing dominance, proving to himself that he could commit any level of violence? Or was it simpler? Was it just about eliminating a witness? Miglin had seen Andrew's face, knew he was there, had to die. And maybe, in the act of killing, Andrew had discovered he enjoyed it. The power, the control, the godlike ability to end another person's existence. After killing Miglin, Andrew spent time in the house. He showered, he shaved, he ate food from the refrigerator. He tried on some of Miglin's clothes. He rested, as if he were a guest rather than a murderer. The psychological disconnection was complete. He felt no remorse, no fear, no humanity. Just cold calculation about his next move. He stole several items, cash, jewelry, and most importantly, Miglin's car. A dark green Lexus, expensive, nondescript enough to not draw attention, perfect for a fugitive trying to blend in. He also took Miglin's cell phone, which was a tactical mistake. The phone could be tracked, but Andrew wasn't thinking clearly now, or maybe he was thinking too clearly, operating on pure predatory instinct without concern for consequences. Lee Miglin's body was discovered the next day, Sunday, May 4th. His wife had returned home from her trip and found the garage door open, which was unusual. She investigated and found the scene of horror. Her husband of 40 years brutally murdered, the house violated, the killer long gone. The Chicago Police Department immediately connected the murder to Andrew Cunanan. The red Jeep was found 2 blocks away, abandoned. Inside were personal items belonging to David Madsen. The connection was undeniable. The manhunt intensified to a fever pitch. The FBI held press conferences. Andrew Cunanan's photograph was shown on every news channel in America. He was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list on May 12th. A reward was offered. Tips poured in from across the country. But Cunanan was already gone from Chicago, already driving the stolen Lexus east, already looking for his next opportunity. The murder of Lee Miglin changed the narrative of the case. The first 2 victims had been people Andrew knew, former lovers, friends, men with whom he had complicated relationships. Those murders could be understood, in a certain light, as crimes of passion, personal grievances escalating to violence. But Miglin was different. Miglin was, as far as anyone could prove, a stranger, an innocent bystander whose only crime was having wealth that Andrew needed and being vulnerable enough to attack. This murder proved that Andrew Cunanan wasn't just settling scores, he was killing anyone who could help him, anyone who had something he wanted, anyone who was unlucky enough to cross his path. The public fear escalated dramatically. If he could kill a complete stranger, then anyone could be next. The manhunt wasn't just about catching a killer anymore, it was about stopping a threat to everyone. Law enforcement agencies across the eastern United States went on high alert. The Lexus was added to every watch list. Toll booth operators were given Cunanan's description. Hotel clerks were warned. Gas station attendants were shown his photo. An entire infrastructure was mobilized to catch one man. And still, he slipped through. Still managed to drive hundreds of miles without being spotted. Still found ways to hide in plain sight. From Chicago, Andrew drove east toward Pennsylvania, then south toward New Jersey. He was heading for the coast, maybe planning to leave the country, maybe just running without any clear destination. The Lexus was too distinctive now, too risky. He needed another vehicle. On May 9th, 6 days after killing Lee Miglin, Andrew Cunanan arrived at Finns Point National Cemetery in Pennsville, New Jersey. It's a remote location, a cemetery for Civil War soldiers. Quiet, isolated, the kind of place where you might not see another person for hours. The cemetery had a caretaker, a 45-year-old man named William Reese. He lived in a small house on the cemetery grounds with his wife Rebecca. He was, by all accounts, a gentleman, kind, dedicated to maintaining the cemetery grounds, to honoring the soldiers buried there. He loved his job. He loved his wife. He had no enemies, no conflicts, no reason to fear anyone. On the evening of May 9th, Rebecca Reese was away visiting family. William was home alone. Andrew Cunanan somehow learned this, either through observation or by chance. He approached the caretaker's office. What happened next was brief and brutal. Andrew shot William Reese in the head with a .40 caliber handgun. One shot, execution style. Reese died instantly, never knowing why, never understanding what was happening. Andrew stole Reese's red Chevrolet pickup truck. He left the Lexus at the cemetery, knowing it would be found quickly, but not caring. He was already moving again, already putting distance between himself and another murder. This killing was different from the others. No torture, no extended violence, just efficient, cold-blooded murder. William Reese had something Andrew needed, a vehicle, and Andrew took it. The life attached to that vehicle was irrelevant, an obstacle to be removed, nothing more. The murder of William Reese broke something in the American psyche. Miglin had been wealthy, part of an elite that seemed distant to most Americans. His murder was horrible but felt, in some way, removed from ordinary life. But William Reese? He was everyman. A working-class guy with a regular job, living in a small house, not wealthy, not connected, not involved in any world that might attract danger. He was just a cemetery caretaker. And he'd been murdered for his truck. If William Reese could be killed, then anyone could. The randomness of it was terrifying. Andrew Cunanan wasn't targeting a specific type of person. He wasn't working through a list. He was killing whoever was convenient, whoever had something he needed, whoever was vulnerable. The FBI investigation team was frustrated and exhausted. They had evidence from 4 crime scenes across 4 states. They had timelines and witness statements and forensic data. They knew where Cunanan had been, but they had no idea where he was going, no sense of his endgame, no way to predict his next move. Behavioral analysts tried to build a psychological profile. They determined that Cunanan was intelligent, organized, capable of planning, but also impulsive, driven by immediate needs, escalating in violence. He was both careful and reckless, both methodical and chaotic. The contradictions made him harder to predict. Some profilers believed he was heading for Mexico or Canada, trying to leave the country. Others thought he was heading for a major city where he could disappear into crowds. Still others believed he had no plan, that he was just running until he got caught or killed. All of them were wrong, because Andrew Cunanan was heading south, to Florida, to Miami Beach, to a final, horrifying act that would make him infamous forever. But the investigators didn't know that yet. They were still chasing leads, still interviewing witnesses, still trying to find patterns in chaos. Meanwhile, the media coverage had become a frenzy. Andrew Cunanan's face was everywhere. America's Most Wanted featured him. News magazines put him on their covers. True crime shows analyzed his psychology. He'd become exactly what his narcissistic personality had always craved: famous, notorious, the center of attention. But that fame came with a cost. His face was so well known now that moving freely was becoming nearly impossible. Every motel clerk might recognize him. Every gas station attendant might call the police. Every random person on the street might do a double-take and reach for a phone. He needed to find a place to hide. A city big enough to get lost in, with enough transient population that a stranger wouldn't stand out, with a community that might be less likely to cooperate with law enforcement. Miami Beach fit all those criteria. It was large, diverse, full of tourists and temporary residents. The gay community there was vibrant and protective of its own, and it was warm, beautiful, a place where someone could live comfortably outdoors if necessary. Andrew Cunanan arrived in Miami Beach sometime in mid-May 1997. He checked into a cheap hotel, the Normandy Plaza. He paid cash, used a fake name, kept a low profile. And for the next several weeks, while the FBI searched for him across the country, he lived quietly, in plain sight, in one of the most visible cities in America. How he survived those weeks remains partially mysterious. He pawned a stolen gold coin from one of his victims. He may have engaged in prostitution. He may have stolen. But he managed to avoid detection, despite being on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, despite his face being shown on television constantly, despite reward money being offered for information leading to his capture. It was an intelligence failure of stunning proportions. Law enforcement had resources, technology, manpower. They were hunting one man whose photograph was everywhere, and he was living openly in Miami Beach for weeks, eating at restaurants, walking on the beach, visiting nightclubs. He should have been caught, immediately, but he wasn't. And that failure would have deadly consequences. Because while Andrew Cunanan was hiding in Miami Beach, he was also watching someone, studying someone, preparing for his final, most audacious kill, the one that would ensure his name would never be forgotten. He was watching Gianni Versace, and he was waiting for the perfect moment. Miami Beach in the summer of 1997 was a city reborn. After decades of decline, South Beach had transformed into a glamorous destination. Art Deco buildings painted in pastels, models and celebrities walking Ocean Drive, fashion shoots on every corner. It was beautiful, vibrant, and utterly confident in its own magnificence. And somewhere in this paradise, hiding among the tourists and beautiful people, was one of America's most wanted fugitives. Andrew Cunanan had arrived in Miami sometime in mid-May, about a week after killing William Reese in New Jersey. He'd driven the stolen red pickup truck south, probably through the Carolinas and Georgia, staying on back roads, avoiding toll booths, sleeping in the truck or in cheap motels where no one asked questions. When he reached Miami Beach, he ditched the truck. It was too recognizable now, too risky to keep. He walked into South Beach carrying everything he owned, which wasn't much. Some clothes, some stolen jewelry and coins he could pawn. The .40 caliber handgun he'd taken from one of his victims, and an overwhelming need to disappear. He checked into the Normandy Plaza Hotel on May 12th. It was cheap, anonymous, the kind of place that catered to people who paid cash and didn't want attention. The kind of place where the desk clerk didn't look too closely at your face or ask too many questions about why you were paying weekly rates in cash. Andrew used a fake name, told some story about being in Miami temporarily, kept to himself, and settled into a strange routine that would last over 2 months. 2 months during which he was, theoretically, one of the most hunted men in America. This period remains one of the most baffling aspects of the entire case. How did Andrew Cunanan, whose face had been plastered on every news channel, whose photograph had been distributed to every law enforcement agency in the country, who was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, managed to live openly in Miami Beach for weeks without being caught? The answer is complicated and deeply frustrating to everyone involved in the investigation. Part of it was luck. Part was the transient nature of Miami Beach, where thousands of tourists came and went weekly, where strangers were everywhere, where no one looked too closely at anyone else. Part was the gay community's historical distrust of law enforcement. Many gay men in Miami Beach in 1997 had lived through the AIDS crisis, had experienced discrimination, had learned to be wary of police. They protected their own. And Andrew, despite being a wanted killer, was still one of their own in a certain sense, or at least they didn't immediately report suspicious strangers to authorities. But part was also law enforcement failure. Tips did come in. People at the Normandy Plaza later said they'd recognized Andrew and called the FBI. Someone at a sandwich shop where he ate regularly said they'd reported him. But these tips were apparently not acted on with urgency. Either they were lost in the flood of false sightings that always accompanies high-profile manhunts, or they were investigated too slowly, or they simply weren't taken seriously enough. Whatever the reason, Andrew Cunanan remained free, and during those weeks he was running out of money, running out of options, and beginning to plan something that would ensure he'd never be forgotten. He pawned a gold coin stolen from Lee Miglin. The pawn shop clerk recognized him from television and called police. But by the time anyone responded, Andrew was gone. He visited gay nightclubs despite the massive risk. He ate at restaurants. He walked on the beach. He was hiding in plain sight, and somehow, impossibly, it was working. But he was also watching someone, studying someone's routine, learning patterns and schedules. Because Andrew Cunanan, narcissist that he was, had decided that if he was going to be caught, and he must have known on some level that capture was inevitable, he was going to go out with a statement. With something so shocking, so audacious, that the world would have to remember him. He was going to kill Gianni Versace. Gianni Versace was, at that moment, at the height of his power and fame. He was 50 years old. He'd built a fashion empire that included clothing, accessories, fragrances, home goods. His designs were worn by celebrities and royalty. His runway shows were events. His name was synonymous with luxury, sensuality, and unapologetic excess. He was also openly gay at a time when that was still relatively rare for someone of his stature. He lived with his partner, Antonio D'Amico, in a relationship that was loving, stable, and public. They'd been together for over a decade. They'd built a life together. Versace's primary residence was Casa Casuarina, a magnificent mansion on Ocean Drive in South Beach. He purchased the property in 1992, then spent millions renovating it into a palazzo that looked transplanted from Renaissance Italy. 3 stories, 24 rooms, a courtyard with a pool lined in 24-carat gold mosaic tiles. It was opulent, outrageous, perfect for a man whose entire brand was built on excess and beauty. Versace loved Miami Beach. He loved the light, the colors, the energy. He divided his time between Miami, New York, Milan, and Lake Como. But Miami was special. It was where he could relax, where he could walk to cafes, where he could enjoy a kind of normalcy despite his fame. And one of his routines, a habit he'd developed over years, was walking to the news cafe on Ocean Drive most mornings to pick up international magazines and newspapers. It was just a few blocks from his mansion. He'd walk there in casual clothes, shorts, a t-shirt, sandals, buy his papers, maybe have a coffee, then walk home. It was a small pleasure, a moment of ordinariness in an extraordinary life, and it made him predictable, vulnerable, a target. Whether Andrew Cunanan and Gianni Versace knew each other before July 15, 1997, has been debated endlessly. Some people claim they'd met years earlier in San Francisco at a party or club. Andrew certainly told people he knew Versace, but Andrew lied about everything, so that claim means nothing. The FBI investigated thoroughly and found no credible evidence of a prior relationship. They concluded that if Versace and Cunanan had met, it was briefly, casually, not memorably. More likely, they'd never met at all. So why target Versace? If Andrew didn't have a personal grievance, if this wasn't about rejection or betrayal or revenge, why kill one of the most famous men in the world? The psychological profile suggested several possibilities. First, fame. Andrew had always craved recognition, had always felt he deserved to be famous. Killing Versace would guarantee that fame. His name would be linked to Versace's forever. Second, symbolism. Versace represented everything Andrew had wanted, but never achieved. Success, wealth, respect, a real place in the world rather than a fake one. Killing him was killing the dream that had always eluded Andrew. Third, nihilism. Maybe Andrew, knowing his time was running out, simply wanted to cause as much damage as possible, to hurt the world that had rejected him by taking away someone the world loved. Or maybe it was simpler. Maybe Andrew saw Versace walking to the cafe, recognized him, and in that moment made an impulsive decision. Maybe there was no deep psychological motivation, just opportunity meeting narcissistic violence. Whatever the reason, by early July, Andrew was definitely stalking Versace. He was watching the mansion, learning the schedule, figuring out when Versace walked to the cafe and when he returned, planning the moment to strike. July 15th, 1997, Tuesday morning. The day started like any other in Miami Beach. Hot, humid, tourists emerging from hotels, locals getting their morning coffee, the sun already intense despite the early hour. Gianni Versace woke up in Casa Casuarina. He had breakfast with Antonio, discussed their plans for the day. Versace had work to do, designs to review, phone calls to make, the endless demands of running a global empire. But first, his ritual, the walk to the news cafe. He left the mansion around 8:30 a.m., wearing shorts and a sleeveless shirt, carrying no security, no bodyguards, just a man taking a walk. He strolled down Ocean Drive, enjoying the morning, greeting people he knew. In his mind, he was already thinking about the magazines he wanted to buy, the coffee he might have, the quiet moment before the demands of the day began. At the news cafe, he bought several magazines, Italian Vogue, some fashion publications, international newspapers. He chatted briefly with people at the cafe. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable. Just Gianni Versace being Gianni Versace, comfortable in his neighborhood, in his routine. He started the walk back to Casa Casuarina, about 2 blocks, a few minutes. He was probably thinking about his day, about designs, about Antonio, about the evening they'd planned, about nothing at all, just enjoying the walk. He reached his mansion, started up the steps to the front entrance. The mansion's gates were open. He was home, safe, or so he thought. Andrew Cunanan had been waiting, watching from somewhere nearby. He'd seen Versace leave, had known he'd return, had positioned himself perfectly. And as Versace climbed those steps, reaching for his keys, Andrew approached from behind. Versace may have heard footsteps, may have turned slightly, we don't know. All we know is what happened next. Andrew Cunanan raised the .40 caliber handgun, the same weapon he'd used to kill David Madsen, the same weapon he'd used to kill William Reese, and he fired, twice. The first bullet struck Versace in the left cheek. It entered his face and exited behind his right ear, tearing through his brain. Catastrophic damage, instant, fatal. The second bullet hit him in the back of the neck as he fell. Gianni Versace collapsed on the steps of his own mansion, blood spreading across the stone, his magazines scattered, his keys falling from his hand. One of the most famous men in the world, dead in seconds, killed in the place where he should have been safest, in the home he loved, on a beautiful morning in paradise. Andrew Cunanan stood over him for just a moment, long enough to be sure, long enough to see what he'd done. Then he turned and ran. He fled on foot, moving quickly through the streets of South Beach. People were starting to emerge. The sound of gunshots had drawn attention. Witnesses saw him running, saw the gun in his hand, started screaming, calling 911, pointing, chasing. But Andrew had planned his escape route. He knew these streets now, had studied them during his weeks in Miami. He ducked into alleys, cut through parking lots, disappeared into the maze of South Beach. Behind him, chaos was erupting. Someone had checked Versace's pulse and found nothing. Police were being called. Ambulances were racing toward Ocean Drive. The news was starting to spread. Gianni Versace had been shot. Gianni Versace was dead, murdered on his own doorstep in broad daylight. Antonio D'Amico heard the commotion from inside the mansion. He ran outside and found his partner dead on the steps. The man he'd loved for 15 years, the man he'd built a life with. Gone, in an instant, for no reason he could understand. The scene on Ocean Drive became pandemonium. Police cordoned off the area, news helicopters began circling, reporters descended on South Beach. Within an hour, the world knew. Gianni Versace, fashion icon, had been assassinated, and the suspect was Andrew Cunanan. The FBI confirmed it quickly. Witnesses had seen him. The description matched. He was in Miami. He'd been there for weeks, and now he'd committed his most infamous murder. The manhunt exploded to an unprecedented level. Every law enforcement officer in South Florida was mobilized. The FBI flooded the area with agents. Roadblocks were set up. The airport and ports were locked down. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the city. Dogs tracked scents. SWAT teams cleared abandoned buildings. Miami Beach was under siege, and somewhere in that city, hiding, trapped, running out of options, was Andrew Cunanan, the most wanted man in America, the killer of 5 people, the man who'd just murdered Gianni Versace. The endgame was beginning, and it would be over within 8 days. The murder of Gianni Versace transformed an already intense manhunt into something unprecedented. This wasn't just another victim, this was a global icon, a man whose work had touched millions, whose death was mourned not just in America, but around the world. Italy declared a day of national mourning. Fashion houses closed in tribute. Celebrities and world leaders expressed their shock and grief, and the pressure on law enforcement to catch Andrew Cunanan became crushing. Every news channel was covering the story continuously. Every newspaper had it on the front page. The public was terrified and angry. How could someone on the FBI's 10 most wanted list have been living in Miami Beach for weeks? How could he have murdered one of the most recognizable men in the world in broad daylight? Questions needed answers. And most importantly, Andrew Cunanan needed to be caught, immediately, before he could kill again, before he could escape, before this catastrophic failure of law enforcement became even more embarrassing. Miami Beach became a locked-down zone. Police set up checkpoints on every bridge connecting the barrier island to the mainland. Every vehicle was searched, every person questioned. The airport was flooded with federal agents, checking every passenger, watching every flight. The ports were similarly locked down. No boat was leaving without inspection. SWAT teams went door to door in South Beach, checking hotels, motels, abandoned buildings. They had K9 units tracking scents. They had helicopters with thermal imaging flying over the city at night. They had undercover officers in gay bars and clubs, hoping Cunanan might show up. They had his photograph displayed everywhere, on telephone poles, in store windows, on the news constantly. The reward for information leading to his capture was raised to $65,000. Tips poured in, hundreds per day. Everyone investigated, almost all of them false. Paranoia gripped Miami Beach. Every stranger became suspect. Every person who looked vaguely like Cunanan was reported. The fear was palpable. But Andrew Cunanan had vanished. Again. Just as he had after killing Jeffrey Trail. Just as he had after killing Lee Miglin. Just as he had after every murder. He developed an uncanny ability to disappear immediately after committing violence, to slip through law enforcement's grasp just when they thought they had him. The question was, where was he hiding? Miami Beach is only 7 square miles. It's an island. Every exit was watched. Every possible hiding place was being searched. Where could he possibly be that thousands of law enforcement officers couldn't find him? The answer was both obvious and infuriating. He was on a boat. A houseboat specifically. One of dozens moored in the Indian Creek waterway, a narrow channel running through the heart of Miami Beach. These houseboats were often vacation properties, sitting empty for weeks or months while their owners lived elsewhere. Perfect hiding places for someone who needed to disappear. Andrew had broken into a houseboat called the Riptide, owned by a man named Torsten Reineck. It was secluded, quiet, stocked with food and water. He'd been there since shortly after killing Versace, just a few miles from the crime scene, while hundreds of police officers searched the streets above him. For 8 days, Andrew Cunanan lived on that boat, trapped, knowing that eventually he'd be found, knowing that escape was impossible. The psychological state he was in during those 8 days can only be imagined. Was he terrified? Defiant? Resigned? Triumphant, believing he'd accomplished something by killing Versace? We'll never know. Because on July 23, 1997, 8 days after murdering Gianni Versace, Andrew Cunanan ended his own life. The caretaker of the marina heard a gunshot around 8 p.m. He called police. SWAT teams surrounded the houseboat. They called out, demanding surrender. No response. They used a bullhorn. Still nothing. They waited, watching, ready for anything. After an extended standoff with no movement from inside, they made entry. They found Andrew Cunanan on the bed. He'd shot himself in the head with the same .40 caliber pistol he'd used to kill 3 of his victims. Single gunshot to the right temple. Death was instantaneous. He'd left no note, no explanation, no confession, no attempt to justify his actions or explain his motivations. He'd simply decided that this was how it ended, and he'd pulled the trigger. The relief among law enforcement was immediate and profound. The manhunt was over. The killer was dead. No more victims, no dramatic arrest or trial that would keep the story alive for months. Just an ending. Sudden, final, anticlimactic in a certain way, but also what everyone needed. The public reaction was more complicated. Satisfaction that he was dead, that he couldn't kill again, that justice, in its own harsh way, had been served. But also frustration, anger, because now they'd never know why, never understand what had driven Andrew Cunanan to kill 5 people. Never get the chance to ask him the questions that had haunted the investigation. Why did you kill Jeffrey Trail? Was it planned or spontaneous? What happened with David Madsen during those 3 days? Why Lee Miglin? Did you know him, or was it random? Why William Reese? And most importantly, why Gianni Versace? Was there a connection? A grievance? Or was it just the ultimate narcissistic act? Killing someone famous to ensure your own fame? All of these questions died with Andrew Cunanan, and that lack of closure would gnaw at investigators, journalists, psychologists, and the public for years. The FBI conducted an extensive psychological autopsy. They interviewed everyone who'd known Andrew. They analyzed his life, his relationships, his behavior patterns. They tried to construct a profile that would explain the transformation from charming socialite to serial killer. What they found was a complex, contradictory personality. Andrew was intelligent but directionless, charming but deeply insecure, narcissistic but plagued by self-doubt. He'd built his entire identity on lies and performance, and when that performance failed, when his carefully constructed world collapsed, he'd reacted with violence. The murders seemed to follow a pattern of escalating rage and desperation. The first killing, Trail, was personal, rage at rejection, at being told he had to face reality. The second, Madsen, was eliminating a witness, but possibly also punishment for perceived betrayal. The third, Miglin, was about resources, but also about proving he could kill anyone, that he was powerful and dangerous. The fourth, Reese, was purely transactional. A man died for his truck. And the fifth, Versace, was about legacy, about ensuring he'd be remembered, about committing an act so audacious that history would have no choice but to record his name. But this analysis, while plausible, remains speculation. We can construct theories, but we can't know for certain. The truth died on that houseboat in Miami Beach. The victims' families were left with impossible grief. Jeffrey Trail's family lost a son, a brother. David Madsen's family lost a talented architect with a bright future. Lee Miglin's family lost a husband, a father, a patriarch. William Reese's family lost a kind, gentle man who'd done nothing to deserve his fate. And the Versace family lost Gianni, the brother, the partner, the creative genius who'd built an empire. 5 families, 5 sets of people who'd never get their loved ones back, who'd never fully understand why their family member had been targeted, who'd carry that loss and that lack of understanding for the rest of their lives. Antonio D'Amico, Versace's partner, was particularly devastated. He'd found Gianni dead on their doorstep, had held him, had called for help, knowing it was too late. The trauma of that moment would haunt him forever. He'd lost his partner of 15 years in the most sudden, violent way possible, and he'd never know why. The Versace murder had profound ripple effects beyond the immediate tragedy. Security for celebrities was fundamentally rethought. The idea that someone famous could simply walk to a cafe without protection was no longer acceptable. Bodyguards became standard. Movement patterns became varied. The spontaneity and normalcy that Versace had enjoyed, walking to get magazines, sitting at cafes, living without constant fear, became luxuries that famous people could no longer afford. The fashion world mourned deeply. Memorial services were held in Milan, in New York, in Miami. Tributes poured in from designers, models, celebrities, artists. Versace had been more than just a designer. He'd been a force, a personality, someone who changed how people thought about fashion and beauty and excess. His loss left a genuine void. Casa Casuarina, the magnificent mansion where Versace had lived and died, eventually became a hotel. You can stay there now, sleep in rooms Versace designed, swim in that gold-tiled pool. It's both a tribute and a commodification, a way to preserve his memory while also capitalizing on the tragedy. The steps where he died are still there, though they've been cleaned, repaired, made part of the landscape rather than a crime scene. For Miami Beach, the murder was a complicated legacy. It brought negative attention to the city. This was where a serial killer had hidden in plain sight for weeks, where one of the most famous men in the world had been gunned down on the street. But it also became part of Miami Beach's mythology, another chapter in the city's history of excess, danger, and drama. The Andrew Cunanan case fundamentally changed how law enforcement handles serial killers and fugitives. The failures of the manhunt, how he evaded capture for months, how tips weren't acted on quickly enough, how he was able to kill 5 people while being actively hunted, led to reforms in information sharing between jurisdictions, in how tips are prioritized and investigated, in how high-profile fugitives are tracked. The FBI created new protocols specifically because of this case: better coordination between local and federal agencies, faster dissemination of information, more resources dedicated to immediate response when fugitives are spotted. These changes came too late for Versace, but they may have prevented future tragedies. Psychologists and criminologists still study Andrew Cunanan. He remains a fascinating and disturbing case study in narcissistic personality disorder, in the transformation from non-violent to extremely violent behavior, in the psychology of serial killers who have no consistent victim profile or clear motivation. The books and documentaries that came later tried to make sense of him. Vulgar Favors, by Maureen Orth, became the definitive account, exhaustively researched, deeply reported. The FX series, The Assassination of Gianni Versace, American Crime Story, introduced a new generation to the story. Each retelling tried to find meaning, to explain the inexplicable. But ultimately, Andrew Cunanan remains unknowable. We can describe what he did. We can analyze his psychology. We can trace his path from San Diego to Miami Beach. But we can't truly understand him, can't get inside the mind that could kill 5 people, destroy multiple families, traumatize a nation, and then simply end itself without explanation. Maybe that's the real horror of this story. Not just the violence, though that was horrific. Not just the famous victim, though that was shocking. But the fundamental unknowability of it all, the lack of a satisfying answer to the question, why? We want killers to make sense. We want their motivations to be comprehensible, even if horrific. We want the story to have a clear narrative arc. This happened, which led to this, which caused this. Cause and effect. Logic. Even twisted logic. But Andrew Cunanan doesn't fit that template. His murders were partially calculated and partially impulsive, partially personal and partially random, partially about specific grievances and partially about nothing at all. He was smart but made stupid mistakes, careful but reckless, charming but monstrous. He was a bundle of contradictions that never resolved into a coherent whole. And when he killed himself, he ensured those contradictions would never be resolved. He took the answers with him, leaving behind only bodies and questions. The serpent had consumed itself. But the poison remained. In the trauma of the victims' families, in the changed security protocols that remind us violence can come from anywhere, in the cautionary tale about narcissism and lies, and what happens when a carefully constructed false identity collapses. Andrew Cunanan wanted to be famous. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name to echo through history. And he achieved that goal. But not in the way he'd always imagined. Not as a successful, sophisticated member of the elite, but as a killer, a monster, a warning. His name is inextricably linked with Gianni Versace's now, mentioned in the same breath, part of the same story. But while Versace is remembered for his creativity, his genius, his contribution to culture, Cunanan is remembered only for destruction, for the lives he took, for the families he destroyed, for the terror he caused. That's his legacy. Not fame, infamy. Not recognition for achievement, recognition for atrocity. He's remembered, yes, but not the way he wanted. Not as someone exceptional, as someone monstrous. And maybe, in a dark way, that's the most fitting punishment. Andrew Cunanan spent his entire life trying to be special, trying to be admired, trying to convince the world he was destined for greatness. And in the end, he achieved the opposite. He became a cautionary tale, a negative example, a story we tell to illustrate what not to be, what not to do, what happens when narcissism and violence collide. The empty frames at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum are monuments to loss. The empty cell where Robert Hansen lived is a monument to betrayal. And the steps of Casa Casuarina, where Gianni Versace died, are monuments to senseless violence and unanswered questions. 3 different crimes, 3 different criminals, 3 different tragedies, but all of them leaving the same thing behind: emptiness, absence, the space where something precious used to be. Andrew Cunanan is gone, has been gone since 1997, but the void he created remains, in the families who lost loved ones, in the fashion world that lost an icon, in the questions that will never be answered, in the nagging uncertainty of why any of it had to happen. The serpent is dead, but paradise never quite recovered. The memory lingers, the tragedy endures. And on Ocean Drive in Miami Beach, tourists still walk past Casa Casuarina, still take photos of the mansion, still remember the beautiful summer morning when violence shattered paradise and changed everything. The story has no satisfying conclusion, no revelation, no moment of clarity where everything makes sense, just an ending. Sudden, violent, final, and deeply, profoundly unsatisfying. Maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories aren't meant to satisfy. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Maybe some tragedies are meant to remain exactly what they are. Tragedies. Senseless, inexplicable, forever haunting. Andrew Cunanan killed 5 people and then himself. That's what we know. Everything else is speculation, theory, guesswork. And it will remain that way forever. The serpent in paradise. The charming sociopath. The man who wanted fame and got infamy. The killer whose motivation died with him. That's Andrew Cunanan. That's his story. And it ends not with answers but with silence. The silence of death. The silence of questions that will never be asked, let alone answered. The silence that follows tragedy and never quite fades. The sun still shines on Miami Beach. The tourists still come. The beautiful people still walk Ocean Drive. Life continues. But the shadow of that July morning in 1997 never quite lifts, never quite fades. The memory remains, the loss endures, and the questions echo, unanswered, through the years. Why? We'll never know. And that's the most terrifying part of all.